Is the history of philosophy one smooth, unbroken story, or are there significant discontinuities? Historians differ on this. Among those supporting a theory of discontinuity, not everyone locates the breaks in the same place. Carlyle belongs to the discontinuity school of historians, but significantly, he thinks one of the most significant breaks occurs between Aristotle and the Roman thinkers of the 1st century BC and after. He writes, "There is no change in political theory so startling in its completeness as the change from the theory of Aristotle to the later philosophical view represented by Cicero and Seneca." He sees the continuation of this idea in the Roman lawyers of the imperial period. Whereas Aristotle is committed to a theory of the natural inequality of types of men, the Romans believed that since reason is common to all men are in respect of their humanity fundamentally equal. The life and writings of Cicero, 106 to 43 BC, gives the lie to the old canard that nothing of significance in political theory happened between the death of Aristotle and the new philosophy of the 16th century. Many consider Cicero to be a mere conduit for the ideas of others. There is some measure of truth in this judgment, but it is far from being the whole truth. Cicero's thought is not original, consisting mainly of compilations and summaries. He regarded himself as an academic skeptic, and indeed his cast of mind was generally sympathetic to skepticism. However, in his ethical and political thought, he clearly inclined towards Stoicism. His early education in philosophy was wide-ranging, but he always claimed an allegiance to the academic school. However, his interests were eclectic, and he reserved the right to take whatever he saw to be good, wherever it might come from. In De Officiis, for example, he adopts a more or less consistently Stoic stance. However, he was not attracted to Epicureanism. As a skeptic, he denied the possibility of absolute knowledge and stressed the merits of the suspension of judgment. However, he did not want skepticism to undermine the value of an active political life. Commenting on this, Holton remarks, "The philosopher must be guided by some understanding of the needs of the city and of the practical consequences of his teachings. He must not risk the chaos that might follow a systematic and ruthless public examination of the principle underlying and guiding a particular order, even an order which strikes him as radically defective, without having given some thought to the alternatives. A defective government, a government which falls far short of the best, may be better than no government at all." Despite his overall commitment to skepticism then, Cicero's mode of thought was syncretistic. The wise man could accept any position that seemed probable while remaining open to arguments on the other side. In ethical and political matters, Cicero tended towards a form of Stoicism. As a philosopher, Cicero was aware of the contested nature of most ethical and political concepts: justice, law, government, authority, and freedom. But as a man of affairs, as a former consul, he was aware of the need to act and to make decisions, and so in practical matters, the suspension of judgment had itself to be suspended. The argument for justice in his Republic, for example, shows little or no trace of the suspended judgment recommended by skepticism. Whatever the merits of Cicero as an original thinker, he possessed one very important attribute that more than compensated for any personal deficiencies. As a communicator and a transmitter of ideas, he is without parallel. Everyone read his writings. Cicero's use of the dialogue form in his works is not unconnected with his eclectic philosophical orientation. As with all dialogues, it's not a simple matter to identify the words of any one interlocutor with that of the author, even when one of the interlocutors is named Cicero. The works of Cicero that principally concern us are the Republic, the Laws, and On Obligations. The texts of Republic and Laws are radically incomplete. Roughly 1/3 of the Republic was discovered on a palimpsest in the Vatican Library in 1820. Cicero's model for his Republic is the work of the same name by Plato. Despite incidental criticisms, Cicero's work shares a significant number of features in common with Plato's dialogue. But Cicero is influenced not only by Plato but also by Aristotle, Carneades, and Polybius. The central topic of Cicero's Republic is often taken to be the constitution of the ideal state, but this may well be a feature of the survival of just that bit of the dialogue that did in fact survive. We know that the fourth book concerned itself with education, the fifth and sixth with the character of the ideal statesman. This presentation of topics would seem to suggest that Cicero was well aware that no matter what constitutional provisions one makes, the character of political society is, in the end, determined by the character of those who participate actively in it. Some parts of the Republic are preserved in the writings of Christians of late antiquity, like Lactantius, Augustine, and Nonius Marcellus. The section of the Republic called The Dream of Scipio was commented on by Macrobius and thereby transmitted to the Middle Ages, where it had a great influence. The various bits and pieces of the Republic scattered here and there were eventually collected in the 16th century, but it wasn't until Cardinal Mai, prefect of the Vatican Library, detected some traces of an earlier text underneath an 8th century copy of St. Augustine's commentary on the Psalms that the first more or less substantial segment of the work was recovered. Mai uncovered about 25% of the work. Cicero's Laws is similarly incomplete. The various extant manuscripts stop after the third book, though there were originally at least 5 books in the dialogue. Now the question underlying both the Republic and the Laws is, what's the best political order? Rudd notes that despite their incomplete state, Cicero's Republic and Laws offer considerable rewards to the modern reader, and especially to the student of the history of political thought. What he thinks is especially noteworthy about these works is their concentration on first principles, such as the idea of political legitimacy and justice, and the ideas of liberty and equality. We know that the Epicureans were inclined to take a dim view of the active political life, and, in line with the general trend of post-Aristotelian Hellenistic philosophy, to counsel withdrawal to private life. Cicero tests and rejects the Epicurean arguments. At this point, he seems to recommend the active life rather than the contemplative life, but elsewhere he expresses another point of view. In the passage I referred to earlier, known as Scipio's Dream, the contemplative life is presented as being superior to the active life. Despite the assertion sometimes made that Cicero was engaged in a futile and retroactive justification of the dying republic, he himself thought that what he was doing was trying to articulate principles that underlay the foundation of any state. As he put it, we are framing laws not just for the Roman people, but for all good and stable communities. Cicero's mature view on politics can be summed up in a number of basic theses. First, the universe is governed by providence. The whole of nature is ruled by the immortal gods with their force, impetus, plan, power, and sway. Second, man is an animal, but one whose power of reason makes him akin to the gods. Whereas men derive the other elements in their makeup from their moral nature, their mind is implanted in them by God. Hence, we have what can truly be called a lineage, origin, or stock in common with the gods. Third, we have been made to share justice with one another, and justice is natural. Justice and its visible expression, law, is based on nature, not merely on opinion. Cicero writes, "There is one single justice. It binds together human society and has been established by one single law. That law is right reason in commanding and forbidding. A man who does not acknowledge this law is unjust, whether it has been written down anywhere or not. Justice is completely non-existent if it's not derived from nature." He also writes, "We can distinguish a good law from a bad law solely by the criterion of nature." And he writes further, "Most foolish of all is the belief that everything decreed by the institutions or laws of a particular country is just." Cicero's major contribution to Western thought was his transmission of the Stoic doctrine of natural law, expressed in his own language, to subsequent thought. Even though the text of the Republic was lost in the 12th century and only partially recovered in the 19th, many of its finest passages had been excerpted and preserved in the works of such as Augustine and Lactantius. The most famous account of natural law, and one that was to have a continuing effect on later thought, is put into the mouths of Laelius. He says, "Law in the proper sense is right reason in harmony with nature. It is spread through the whole human community, unchanging and eternal, calling people to their duty by its commands and deterring them from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. When it addresses a good man, its commands and prohibitions are never in vain. But those same commands and prohibitions have no effect on the wicked. This law cannot be countermanded, nor can it be in any way amended, nor can it be totally rescinded. We cannot be exempted from this law by any decrees of the Senate of the people, nor do we need anyone else to expound or explain it. There will not be one such law in Rome and another in Athens, one now and another in the future. But all peoples at all times will be embraced by a single and eternal and unchangeable law. And there will be, as it were, one Lord and Master of us all, the God who is the author, proposer, and interpreter of that law. Whoever refuses to obey it will be turning his back on himself. Because he has denied his nature as a human being, he will face the gravest penalties for this alone, even if he succeeds in avoiding all the other things that are regarded as punishments." This very stoic paean to law is put into the mouth of Laelius. Is it Cicero's own view? Remember, Philus, another interlocutor in the dialogue, expresses realpolitik sentiments to the effect that it is neither possible nor desirable always to follow the strict demands of justice. Should we likewise attribute these views to Cicero? And if one attribution is suitable, why not the other? Law is not ultimately derived from the 12 tables of the Praetor's edict, but from the nature of man. Cicero again. We must clarify the nature of justice, and that has to be deduced from the nature of man. Then we must consider the laws by which states ought to be governed. This account of law echoes that put into Laelius's mouth in the Republic, although it is surrounded by the usually sceptical caveat that it may not be wholly correct. However, we find further evidence in the laws that this view of law may in fact be Cicero's own. There, in his own person, he remarks, quote, "According to the opinion of the best authorities, law was not thought up by the intelligence of human beings, nor is it some kind of resolution passed by communities, but rather an eternal force which rules the world by the wisdom of its commands and prohibitions. In their judgment, that original and final law is the intelligence of God, who ordains or forbids everything by reason." Cicero's fourth thesis is this: despite their local differences, human beings are essentially the same. Quote, "There is no essential difference within mankind. Reason, in fact, the one thing in which we are superiors to the beasts, which enables us to make valid deductions, to argue, refute our opponents, debates, solve problems, draw conclusions, that certainly is common to us all. For the same things are grasped by the senses of all, and those things that act on the senses of all alike. And those rudimentary perceptions that are impressed on the mind are impressed alike on all minds. Speech, human speech, which interprets the mind, according to Cicero, uses different languages but expresses the same ideas." Now this is a vital point, overcoming the localism and particularism that has plagued and continues to plague human history. It wouldn't be too far-fetched to take Cicero to derive his philosophical egalitarianism from the Stoic conception of oikeiosis, a process by which every living entity is attached to everything that shares its nature. All men, then, are equal not in character or talents, disposition, appearance, personality, wealth, or possessions, but equal in their essential humanity. All men have the same ability to experience the world. All can distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. The fundamental moral identity of all men is expressed very clearly in the following passage from the Laws. Cicero says, "Now there is no single thing that is so similar to, so like anything else as all of us are like one another. Reason, in fact, is common to us all." The contrast of this idea with that of classical Greek thought, as found in Plato and Aristotle, is stark. For Aristotle, men were not equal, and so citizenship had to be restricted. For Cicero, all men possess the same reason, are subject to the same universal law, and, in those respects, are all equal. From this perspective, a slave cannot be seen, as Aristotle had seen him, as a living tool, but, at worst, as a worker on a lifelong contract with very bad terms. Cicero's fifth thesis is this: the development of our human potential demands that we live with one another in community. The most basic reason for the coming together of human beings in community is not mutual need, though that is a factor, but, as Cicero puts it, a sort of innate desire on the part of human beings to form communities, for our species is not made up of solitary individuals or lonely wanderers. There are two conceptions of man that are mutually exclusive and universally exhaustive. Whichever of these incompatible conceptions of man one adopts has a significantly different effect on what one takes to be a plausible political theory. The first conception takes man to be an essentially isolated individual who, out of necessity, associates with others for mutual defense and aid. On this view of things, society and the state are artificial constructs. The second conception takes man to be an essentially social being. On this view, society and the state are organic developments of man's natural sociability. The first conception could reasonably be associated with the Epicureans, the second with the Stoics. On this matter, Cicero, the great eclectic, is on the side of the Stoics. Society is natural. The state, the republic, grows naturally from society, in particular from the family. The republic is founded on justice and law and exists to further human well-being. In the Republic, Scipio gives us a definition of the term republic. A republic, he says, is the property of the public. But a public is not every kind of human gathering, congregating in any manner, but a numerous gathering brought together by legal consent and community of interest. The primary reason for human beings coming together is not so much weakness as a sort of innate desire on the part of human beings to form communities. For our species is not made up of solitary individuals or lonely wanderers. From birth, it is of such a kind that even when it possesses abundant amounts of every commodity, and here the text breaks off. Republics, then, are not artificial entities, but natural outgrowths of human sociability. Human existence is dependent on life in the human community. That being so, Cicero says, as magistrates are subject to laws, the people are subject to the magistrates. In fact, it is true to say that a magistrate is a speaking law, and law a silent magistrate. Nothing is so closely bound up with the decrees and terms of nature, and by that I wish to be understood as meaning law, as authority. Without that, no house or state or clan can survive. No, nor the human race, nor the whole of nature, nor the very universe itself. For the universe obeys God. Land and sea abide by the laws of the universe, and human life is subject to the commands of the supreme law. The state, then, is a corporate body belonging jointly to its citizens. Its purpose is the provision of just government and mutual aid. Political power is the corporate power of the people exercised on their behalf by those chosen to do so. If the magistrate governs the people, the law governs the magistrate. As one might expect, given what Cicero has written about the universal law to which all men are subject, the state and its magistrates are subject to it as well. This universal law transcends particular human choices and particular human institutions. George Sabine notes that these general principles of government, that authority proceeds from the people, should be exercised only by warrant of law, and is justified only on moral grounds, achieved practically universal acceptance within comparatively a short time after Cicero wrote, and remained commonplaces of political philosophy for many centuries. It follows from Cicero's conception of the universal law binding all men that a state cannot properly exist unless it gives effect to the mutual obligations and rights that come from this law. Sabine again writes, "Unless the state is a community for ethical purposes, and unless it is held together by moral ties, it is nothing," as Augustine said later, "except highway robbery on a large scale." Cicero has nothing particularly novel to say about the ultimately desirable political regime. He considers the usual 6 types of regime: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and their respective defective counterparts. The best regime for Cicero is that in which the wise rule. But the best is not always available or possible. The mixed regime is a good second best. The justification of this is by appeal to the settled experience of many generations. Cicero's conclusion is fundamentally the same as Plato's. The perfectly just regime probably lies outside the range of human possibilities. Its demands are too severe. The wise statesman, while seeking to be guided in his practice by such standards, will begin with the understanding that there is little likelihood, given the nature of man and the political community, that they can or will be realized fully in any state. So writes Holton.